In some of the recent episodes, I happened to take a few themes regarding social issues in Korea, bullying in school, life in Goshiwon, and today's episode would be once again dealing with a dark, forgotten side of the society, as told by trauma cleaners. Trauma cleaners are people who cleanse out the scenes of death, whether it be from homicide, suicide, or lone death, that are often neglected for significant length of time. That means the job usually has to deal with the remainder of decomposition. I confess I came up with this idea for a morbid interest to start with, and indeed I found some gruesome accounts too, but quickly I was struck more by the various human story and social issues behind them, because however they died and in what state their bodies were found, they were all once a living person with all the complex life story of their own, and the process of trauma cleaning lay them plain bare. Modern Korea is a dynamic and bustling, but also a tough place to live in. The old family community network that took care of the lonely and vulnerable is quickly disappearing in the highly competitive modern society, while the welfare system is not yet fully in place. The result is the silent deaths in the form of a lone death or suicide of those who fell through the social safety net. Today's stories are reflecting that sad reality. First story is more a scary paranormal account. Well, that's my channel. But the other two are more somber stories that I hope to leave you contemplate over the weight of our life and relationships. As a word of warning, there are some graphic description of the scenes, and if you're squeamish, today's episode may not be for you. So, here are 3 allegedly true stories from trauma cleaners. As always, handpicked, translated and narrated by your host, Anthony. Back in 2005, I just graduated from high school and was looking for a part-time job that would pay good. My plan was to work hard for those few months before the start of college to be able to fund a fantastically fun first semester there. But of course it was easier said than done. It was before all the internet sites and apps for job seekers, and one had to rely on want ad on community papers or visit around the potential workplaces one by one. Then I got a call from a friend in the similar shoes that he'd found a position with a very good pay, 100,000 won a day, something like $100 back then. One didn't need any particular experience or skill either. Well, what kind of job is that? Was naturally my question.
Well, it's basically cleaning a house,
he said. Yes, cleaning a house where somebody died in. It was usually a lone resident who committed suicide or an elderly who died unexpectedly, he explained. In such a case, the body would be found in a various stage of decomposition, and it'd be required to clean out the entire household, including the floor and wall coverings.
It's midwinter, so at least you won't see the swamp of maggots,
he said. I was young and reckless, so said yes without thinking too much. So I was called to a house at a typical residential area in Seoul, full of dingy multi-household houses. I was already told not to try to find out the details about the case, so I just shut my mouth and started peeling the floor coverings and wallpapers off. The friend who linked me to the job, well, he had drunk too much previous night and couldn't come to the work himself. I was the only newbie and the youngest among the cleaners, so I kept silent all day long apart from occasional yes and okay. I was quietly panicking inside though as the day progressed. It was a small space of 50-60 square meters, and on the floor were dark stains all over. The biggest room was the worst, but the stains continued in the living room and beyond. I couldn't tell for sure, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that they were blood stains. We were instructed that we didn't need to save anything, so we broke down the furniture with a sledgehammer. Normally such a loud work in a dense residential area would stir up complaints from the neighbors, but the few people who gathered outside simply whispered among themselves something like, "Gosh, at last!" As I piled up the broken pieces of household up in the lorry, I further heard a couple of ladies talking. "Poor kids, they didn't deserve it." "So didn't I tell you that I got a bad vibe from the father?" I pretended to make a cigarette break and listened out for what was further said. "What happened to the kids?" "Gosh, don't you know? You see, their father..." To sum it up, the father of the family used to run his own business until it went bankrupt during the financial crisis, and the family had to move into this dingy little place. Just one of many such cases from the time. But then, the youngest kid also got ill with a chronic problem, and despaired father hammered his wife and strangled his 2 kids to death, and he himself swallowed herbicide. To be fair, it wasn't an uncommon story just a few years after the major financial crisis in the country, but I couldn't help but feel spooky and dirty to step into the very place where the family side took place. I understood why other cleaners told me not to get curious. The work wrapped up about 9 p.m. Other cleaners were going for a drink together, but I wasn't in the mood at all. Maybe it was the mood, but the way back home felt strangely eerie, as if the whole grey town was deserted. As I walked along the empty alley, my mind was somehow fixated with a foreboding that I shouldn't look back. But, well, just like all those characters in horror films, I couldn't resist to do exactly that. And I saw something hiding away, or should I say felt rather than saw. I'd been the typical reckless youth who swaggered around as if I owned the world, but I couldn't help but feel the chill running down my spine at that moment. I ran to get out of the alley as soon as possible. But even on the bus with other passengers on board, I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was staring at my back. I couldn't possibly continue with this work, I thought. Chicken or not, I should call the agency tomorrow that I was quitting. As I got off the bus, once again, my eyes unwittingly glimpsed back, and at the farthest back seat of the bus was sitting a woman and 2 kids. They didn't look anyway funny, but nevertheless I was struck by the impression that they were not humans. For the rest of the way, I ran. I thought I saw something in the dark corners of the street, but I couldn't dare to give them a look anymore. And just so happened, I returned to an empty home. Dad was often away for work anyway, but Mom wasn't home either, leaving a note that she was going to stay at her parents' that night. I just jumped in my bedroom, sneaked in underneath the duvet, and just stared at the door. And why should it creak open just then? I freaked out now. I turned on the TV in the living room, set the volume to max, and also played on the computer in my room an anime I had downloaded, just to avoid sitting in the suffocating silence. I went back underneath the duvet, but this time with the door opened because I didn't want to see it opening by itself again. Then a noise of something falling down startled me. It was from the small room we used as storage. By now I was so paranoid that I took out the wildest looking knife from my military knife collection and went to the room. As again, just like the characters in horror films, I couldn't resist the urge to check in because not knowing was worse than facing the horror. So I kicked the door to the storage open. There was nothing out of order. Half relieved, half irritated, I came back to my room, but something wasn't right. It was so quiet. Had I not turned up the volume of the TV and the computer? It was then I felt kind of chilling air blowing through my ear. It sounded like a woman whispering, but it spoke so quickly I could not understand, just a sense of gibberish endlessly tweeting in my ears. I could not move a finger, just hoping that at least it didn't reveal itself, that this nightmare should pass quickly. But then, itchy feeling crept up from my legs. My mind was telling me not to look, but once again I could not resist. Still not daring to move, I just rolled my eyes down, and a little boy, his body half submerged under the floor as if it were water, was hanging onto my leg. When I looked down, he smiled, his lips spreading literally ear to ear. I ran out the street, barefooted and no jacket on my back. I just ran all the way to the main road. I found a 24 open bar and drank till the dawn broke. Fortunately, I didn't see them again ever since. But the creepy feeling that something's behind my back can I still not shake off. Think twice before you choose your work. I run a trauma cleaning service business. One rainy June day, I got a call.
Hello. So, a tenant passed away my property. I got your number from the detective in charge. Could you come around as soon as possible?
Now, a rainy day is not the best day for this kind of job. Trauma cleaning usually takes at least a couple of days. From my experience, it's tricky to get rid of the smell of decay in anything shorter than that. And rainy day usually adds at least another day because the humid air makes it more difficult to air out the space. Unfortunately, that means higher bill at the end. The client was already waiting for us outside the building. The old flat that looked to have been built in the 80s looked crumbling and uncared for, that it wouldn't have been a surprise if I heard it was to be demolished. On top of the heavy humid air, the poorly designed steep staircase made it even more difficult to walk up 3 floors. We could smell it already outside a closed door. Inside was the futon and duvet stained with bodily fluid, and all over the floor were thousands of empty pupas, a sign that the dead body had been left undiscovered for a long time. As we stepped in, the dried pupas crackled under our feet and flew into the thick air. After a quick look around, we came out to discuss the estimated fee with the client.
"Please, wait a minute,"
she said, and tried to call somebody on the phone a few times.
"Jeez, he's not picking up."
"Whom are you trying to contact?" I asked.
"I'm calling the son of the deceased,"
she said. The body of her former tenant was found good 2 months after he passed away. His body had already melted down into black goo by then. After the brief police investigation, they contacted the deceased son and tried to discuss about the funeral and legal procedure. But he was plain indifferent. He claimed his dad divorced his mom long time ago, and he himself hadn't met him for 13 years, that he was no better than a stranger. In the end, the deceased was classified as a person with no family and contacts, and the responsibility to deal with the aftermath came down to our client, the landlady. All the while she explained the situation, she was keep dialing the same number.
Hello.
Yes, I'm the landlady of your late father. Today I called in cleaners to empty his room, and I think you should come around.
Why?
The landlady's face changed at the son's emotionless reply.
Why? Why? It's your father!
Her voice got louder and tried to half exhort, half reason with the guy on the phone, but all was no use. After the bitter call, she told us in a low voice to go ahead with the job. So we took out the beddings with the black stains and pillows with the tissues and hair stuck on it. Underneath were all sorts of beetles and arthropods crawling. Inside a protective suit and gloves, I and my colleague were already soaked with sweat. As we went through books and documents, we found some photos and about 10 bank books. Altogether, the sum would amount to 15 million won, about $11,000. I showed them to the landlady and told her she'd have to inform the deceased son.
What for? He denies it's his father anyway. Just destroy them, she said.
Unfortunately, the son's legal right to the inheritance still stood as far as I understood. I advised her it would be the best to avoid any further trouble.
What a nonsense! A law is for people. A guy who denies his own father in death is not human,
she vented out. But in the end, dialed the son's number, and again after several attempts, passed on the news about the saving.
He's on his way now. He who didn't even bother to answer my calls,
landlady said after the call. About half an hour later, the landlady reported back.
Well, the son came by and took the bank books only. He's not interested in the photos. Throw them away with other things, please.
The work carried on into late night, and we went to a restaurant nearby to have a late dinner. The story of the lone death had been already the talk among the neighborhood, and the restaurant owner didn't mind spilling what he knew about the deceased. By the time he moved into the flat, he already looked like a man with one foot in the grave, skeletal and clearly ill. Every night, he picked up some cheap sandwich and soju on the way back. When the restaurant owner said he should eat something more substantial, he simply said he had no appetite. He was never seen with anybody else, no family or friends. From my experience, his story is sadly typical of a lone death case of over 50. Shunned from family and socially isolated, death by loneliness, poor lifestyle, and chronic illness. Sadly so.
I should like to commission a cleaning and clearing out task. I'm the creditor of the dead.
I got a call one day early summer 2013. As a professional trauma cleaner, I get to see all sorts of situations, but it was the first time that I got a commission from a creditor of the deceased. Usually it would be a family member, landlord, or sometimes the public officer in charge of the case. The client gave us a little breakdown that the deceased was a young woman in her 20s and killed herself by poison in a council flat. The council management failed to find any family or relation to her, and somehow the responsibility was handed down to the creditor.
I want the job done as economically as possible. Would you buy up usable electronics and household?
It wasn't that I couldn't understand the situation of the creditor, but I don't get involved with the sale of households. It's a whole different business, and I had no storage space for that either. So the job started off with more complicated note already, and when we arrived, it got even more complicated. The flat was left untouched 2 months after the body was removed. In that mess was a dog that belonged to the deceased. The council flat management tried to send it to a shelter, but they refused because the dog could not be considered as a stray dog. Poor dog seemed in an unstable condition after 2 months of isolation.
"Well, it's not my business,"
was the cold response from the management.
Can't you take care of it? I'm not interested in a dog,
was the response from the client. But I couldn't be bullied into a responsibility that was not part of my job. I told the client I would rather refrain from the job altogether, and his attitude instantly changed to more pleading. Clearly he already knew about the dog, and all his previous attempts to deal with it had failed. In the end, I contacted friends and family around to look for somebody to adopt the dog, and managed to find an old distant relative who retired to countryside. Upon receiving the dog, he mentioned it was not in a good health, considering it was overweight and had a dry nose and bumps around the eyes. Anyway, I was back to the job, and there was further complication. The flat management demanded to take photos of every item retrieved for potential legal issues, which would surely slow the process much more. I had to call the client once again to discuss. He talked to the management himself, but they didn't come to agreement, and once again I left the site. It took a few days till they came up with an agreement, and I got to get on with the work finally. But that wasn't the end of the drama. When a person with no relation dies, especially in a poor neighborhood as was this case, and when the rumor about the death has been already around, we get various people coming around the site like a vulture looking for a prey, trying to take whatever of any value. My principle is not to allow anybody to take anything. Even when the deceased died without any family or will, there are always some people or authority who have alleged claim. Besides, once the word spread and people start to flock around, it becomes very difficult to control and proceed with the cleaning. So, when an old lady barged into the flat saying,
"Poor girl, I used to share food and snack with her. Oh, this could be still useful,"
and picked up the electric fan, I had to step in. When it became clear that I wouldn't let her, she threw the fan to the floor and walked out mumbling something to herself. And then a 40-something looking man came by and tried to take away the TV without a word. When I blocked him, he said,
"I'm the dead girl's uncle."
"Can you prove it? I heard the authority failed to locate any family," I said.
"Hey, not a blood relation, but I treated her like my own niece when she was alive."
The man tried to get away with the TV while he was saying this excuse. The deceased left uncleared debt, and her creditor has claim for all this stuff. If you want a TV, you'd have to talk to my client, the creditor. I said, and called the client and handed the phone to the man. But of course, there was no way for the client to buy whatever the unlikely argument from the man. After about 5 minutes talk, which gradually escalated to a heated argument, the man walked out barehanded, spitting, "I'd kill him," between his teeth. Even after him, there were various people, including an old woman eyeing on the pots or a middle-aged woman rummaging through the clothes, and I had to turn them away one by one. Amongst the papers was the dead woman's last will. It noted down her lone existence in the world without any family or relatives, trauma from the betrayal of her trusted friend, and a wish that her dog to be euthanized and cremated together. The short, simple note was dripping with desperation the deceased must have felt before her extreme choice. Sad thing was, I must be the only one who read it through, and there was nobody to execute or indeed care about her last will. During the 3-day work at the flat, I hoped somebody, however remotely related to her, come by so that I could hand over the last words of the dead. But there was none. I heard a poor dog died before the end of the following winter. And just like that, the dead woman's trace had disappeared completely, with nothing and nobody to remember her by. Hi, it's Anthony here, and thank you very much for listening. I don't know how you found today's stories. They definitely left me feeling a bit heavy, but not in a destructive sense. They gave me lots to think about the life, death, relationship with my family and friends, and the dry reality of death in the society. I hope you found them in the similar vein too. I bring you various scary, weird stories, but ultimately I hope them to touch something more valuable, themes like our fear, taboo, society, and life, beyond the titillating fun. Let me know how you found today's stories in the comment. If you enjoyed my work, please give it a like and a comment, and please consider subscribing to my channel to beat the YouTube algorithm and help the channel grow. If you'd support me more directly, I also have a Buy Me a Coffee account. The link's in the description. Buy Me a Coffee supporters will get access to my new videos a week ahead of others. Thank you. I'll come back with, well, hopefully something a bit lighter. Stay safe and take care.